So now you've learned a little bit about how to use Excel, I wanted to take you through some best practice principles, really simple things that will help you to use Excel in the correct way and will help other people to use your spreadsheets as you build them. So I've got 6 easy things that we need to go through. The first one is to always start your data in the top left-hand corner of the sheet, unless you've got a really good reason not to. The reason for that, as you will find as you learn how to use other elements of Excel like pivot tables, is that it's the easiest place on the page from which you can analyze your data. So it's the easiest place where you can put filters. It's the easiest place to create a pivot table from. It's the easiest place to create a chart from. Also, Excel is much better at sorting data when you use your row headers in row 1, and just generally Excel works a lot better if you start your data at the top of the page. Now that's different from if you're producing some analysis. So if you're producing a report like what we have on the screen here, you might want to put a header at the top of the page. That's fine, but for analyzing the data itself in terms of a sheet of data, I always recommend you start it in cell A1. The second thing to bear in mind is that you shouldn't have more than one table per sheet unless it's a report that you're going to publish. So if you're just talking about data where you're storing data within tables, don't have more than one of them per sheet. And if you look at this example that we've got here, I've actually broken that rule. I've got 2 tables in one sheet. Now I could say that's okay because this is more or less what I would say a presentation report that I might print out and give to management, so it's quite good to have them both on the same page. But in terms of analyzing data, I would keep them separate. The reason for that is if you're using autofilter, when you autofilter one of your tables, it's going to hide rows in your other table. And similarly, if you add or delete rows to one of the tables, it's also going to add or delete rows to the other table if it's further across the page. That's not great. Even if you're really good at keeping on top of that and not making mistakes, it's really easy to forget that you might also be deleting data from the wrong table. So you need to be really careful with that. The third thing is using correct naming conventions. So this applies to headers in data, and it also applies to sheet names. So in this particular example, I've used the word charts to describe this sheet. Now, if this was a proper management report, I might rename that to management dashboard and then the current date or something like that. Because if you've got multiple sheets in one spreadsheet, you want to give as much information to the end reader as possible to help them to understand where they should be looking and what they're actually looking at on each page. So if you use clear naming, so name your fields very clearly in your data and name your sheets very clearly too, then that will go a long way to helping make sure that your work gets understood properly. Another best practice that I use in all of my work, and highly recommend that you do it too, is to use a glossary. So whenever you create a spreadsheet, it's inevitably going to be used by somebody else at some point, especially if you're doing it at work. So whether you're leaving your job, you're handing off a process to somebody else, you're creating a report for your manager, anything like that, it is inevitable that somebody else is going to have to try to understand your work. So I always try to add an extra sheet and call it glossary or definitions or further information or something like that to point the reader towards a few lines of text where you say what the spreadsheet does, where the data came from, what the basic field names mean, and any particular caveats that are around that data or that report. It can be a little bit time consuming, but it's well worthwhile. There's just one further point to make, which is that when you're entering dates in Excel, I think I mentioned this earlier when we were looking at formats of the data that you can enter into cells, is that you need to make sure that you enter dates in a format that Excel can recognize and not type them as text. So just to give you an example, if I click in here and say the 1st of November 2014, Excel is quite intelligent and it can recognize that that's a date. So it's automatically formatted it as a date. But if I typed 1st Nov 14, Excel doesn't convert that into a date. So Excel currently sees this as just a piece of text that I've written into the cell. It doesn't know that it's a date. The easiest way to write dates is just simply using numbers and slashes. So I could write the 1st of the 11th 14. Of course, that's European date format. If you were in the US, you would write 11/1, not 1/11. And if you hit enter there, then Excel recognizes that as a date too. And you can see that these two dates, the top one and the bottom one, have actually come out in different formats. That doesn't actually matter. They're both dates that Excel can recognize, and the style that it's written on the page in is purely cosmetic. So if I was to select both of those, right click, go to format cells and go to date, I could pretty much choose any kind of date here that I wanted. I actually quite like the day, the month and the year, and now we have them both in the same format. But that date format would not work if I tried to apply it to this cell. So it's just Excel doesn't know that it's a date. So that's the one final thing, is make sure that when you're entering dates, you enter it in a format that Excel will recognize. The reason for that is because you might want to do some calculations on dates. So you might want to work out the duration between one day and another by subtracting one date from another. And if Excel doesn't know that it's a date, then it won't be able to do that calculation. So very, very important point. So that's really some really basic practices that you can implement to immediately improve the quality of your work in Excel.